The maps hanging in museums and county courthouses tell a comforting lie. They make the empty places of America seem as though they have always belonged to fences, roads, and names printed in black ink. They suggest that every valley has been measured, every ridge understood, and every stretch of prairie patiently explained. But there are corners of this country where the land has never truly accepted the names people forced upon it. Out in the forgotten grasslands that stretch across the borderlands of Texas and eastern New Mexico, there are miles where the wind moves exactly as it did centuries ago, where old wagon trails disappear beneath fresh dust each morning, and where silence carries more weight than thunder. Ranchers still avoid certain draws after sunset. Hunters refuse to camp near particular dry creek beds. Older families rarely explain why. They simply say that some places are old enough to remember a world before people imagined they owned it. What I'm about to tell you came from a man who believed that memory belongs to the land itself. I met him during the autumn of 1901 while traveling through a government settlement not far from the Pecos River. I had been hired to gather stories from aging scouts, traders, and native elders before time carried them away forever. Most spoke about buffalo hunts, battles, long winters, and vanished rivers. Only one refused to speak after sunset. Every interview ended before the last light disappeared behind the horizon. At first I believed he was simply old and tired, but after 3 days I realized something else governed his routine. He feared the dark with a seriousness I had never witnessed in another man. His name on official records was Samuel Gray Elk, though he quietly admitted that was never the name given to him by his people. He was nearly 70 years old, broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver hair tied behind his neck and a burn scar stretching from one ear to the corner of his jaw. He often rested his fingers against that scar while choosing his words, as though the memory beneath it still ached. On the fourth morning, I asked why he refused to continue our conversations after sunset. He stared through the open doorway toward the endless prairie before answering. "Because night remembers voices," he said. "And once you're reminded of yours, it begins listening." Those words stayed with me long after he spoke them. They carried none of the excitement common in campfire tales. There was no attempt to frighten me. He spoke the sentence the same way another man might explain tomorrow's weather. It was simply a fact. He poured coffee into 2 battered tin cups before beginning the story he had hidden from every previous visitor. "When I was 12, he said, my grandfather warned me that there were places where the earth walked before people did. He said most creatures leave tracks because they travel across the world. But there's another kind that leaves tracks because the world itself moves beneath them." I laughed then, young enough to mistake confidence for wisdom. My grandfather did not laugh. He took a stick and drew a perfectly straight line across the dirt between us. "If you ever find footprints that refuse to wander," he whispered, "leave before you finish counting them." I asked what kind of footprints he meant. He answered with another question. "Have you ever seen a man walk without curiosity? Every traveler turns his head. Every hunter stops. Every child chases something shiny. But what if you found prints made by something that never looked left or right? Something that already knew exactly where it was going?" I had no answer. Neither did anyone else sitting around that fire. Several older warriors quietly looked toward the darkness beyond the flames, and that silence frightened me more than any ghost story ever could. Months later, I understood why. During the spring hunt, our camp followed antelope north across country, so flat that sunrise seemed to arrive from beneath the ground instead of above it. The grass reached our knees, the sky stretched forever, and every direction looked exactly like the last. Near midday, one of the hunters called for everyone to stop. We gathered around a strip of damp earth left behind after recent rain. Across the mud ran a single trail of barefoot prints. They belonged to no child, no woman, no warrior we recognized. Each footprint measured nearly twice the length of a grown man's foot, perfectly shaped, with long, narrow toes pressed deeply into the earth. Stranger still, every print sat precisely in front of the previous one. No hesitation, no wandering, no change of pace. They crossed the mud in an arrow straight line, before continuing into dry grass where they disappeared. One hunter suggested following them. My grandfather grabbed the man's arm, so hard his knuckles turned white. "Not another step," he ordered. No one argued. We circled wide around the tracks and continued hunting without another word. That night, no songs were sung. Even the children sensed something had changed. I asked my grandfather what had frightened everyone. He stared into the flames until they reflected inside his eyes. "Because those prints are older than stories," he finally answered. "And stories survive because enough people ignored the warning before us." Years passed before I encountered the tracks again. By then, I had become a scout, traveling with traders, moving supplies between isolated settlements. There were 6 of us crossing open country during late October, a season when cold winds arrive without warning. On the 3rd evening, we made camp beside a dry wash where scattered cottonwoods offered the only shelter for miles. The oldest trader among us was named Elias Morgan, a cheerful man who believed every mystery could be solved with daylight and patience. After supper, he wandered beyond the fire to relieve himself. A minute later, we heard him call. His voice sounded calm enough that none of us rushed. When we reached him, he pointed toward the ground without speaking. Barefoot prints crossed the moonlit dust less than 20 yards away. The line traveled directly through our camp as though whoever made them had never noticed 6 armed men sitting beside the fire. Elias bent to examine one. Before his fingers touched the print, every horse tied nearby jerked violently against their ropes. One mare screamed with such terror that she broke free and vanished into the darkness. Every other animal followed. Within seconds, we were standing alone beneath a sky suddenly emptied of sound. No coyotes, no insects. Even the wind had disappeared. Elias slowly stood. His face had become pale. "Did anyone hear that?" he whispered. None of us answered because we all had. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a woman softly called someone's name. Then another voice answered from a different direction. Then another. Every voice belonged to someone each of us had lost years earlier. One man heard his dead wife. Another heard his father. I heard my younger sister laughing exactly as she had before scarlet fever carried her away. The voices never shouted. They simply invited us to come a little farther into the night. No one moved. We stood shoulder to shoulder until dawn painted the horizon silver. When sunlight finally reached the prairie, the voices stopped instantly. The footprints remained. They continued west for nearly 100 yards before ending in empty ground with no sign of where their owner had gone. No return tracks. No rocks nearby. No animal burrows. Nothing. Elias stared at the final print for nearly a minute before quietly removing his hat. "Whatever made these," he whispered, "doesn't travel the way living things do." We abandoned half our supplies that morning because recovering the horses mattered more than cargo. We found only 2 animals alive. The others were never seen again. From that day forward, none of us camped on open ground if another choice existed. Yet the strangest part of that journey came weeks later when we reached the nearest settlement. An elderly widow listened silently as Elias described the footprints. Before he finished, she interrupted him with a single question. "Did the voices ask you to follow?" Elias nodded without speaking. She closed her eyes and crossed herself. "Then you were fortunate," she whispered. The first invitation is always the gentlest. No one around the table asked what she meant. Looking back after all these years, I think every person present already knew the answer, but hoped someone else would say it aloud instead. The widow never explained what she meant by that warning, and none of us were eager enough to ask. People who spend their lives near the frontier learned that there are questions better left alone. Still, her words followed me for years. The first invitation is always the gentlest. At the time, I dismissed it as the superstition of an old woman who had spent too many winters alone. But the older I became, the more often I remembered the look in her eyes when she said it. She had not sounded frightened. She had sounded certain. 3 years passed before I understood why. During that time, I worked as a scout, guide, and sometimes a hunter for wagon trains moving through isolated country. I saw dust storms large enough to swallow the horizon. I saw men freeze during blizzards after surviving gunfights and droughts. I buried friends and watched towns appear where only prairie had existed months before. Yet through all those years, I never again saw the strange footprints. Eventually, I convinced myself that whatever we encountered that night had been a rare curiosity, something I would never cross paths with again. Then came the winter of 1887. It was a hard winter, even by frontier standards. Snow arrived early and stayed longer than anyone expected. Livestock died by the thousands. Rivers froze. Travelers disappeared between settlements and were never found. In late December, I joined a small party searching for a missing ranch hand named Caleb Turner. He was 21 years old, strong, experienced, and familiar with the country. 3 days earlier, he had ridden out to repair fencing after a storm and failed to return. At first, his employer assumed weather had delayed him. By the second day, concern began spreading through the ranch. By the third, a search party was organized. 6 of us rode out before sunrise. We found Caleb's horse shortly after noon. The animal stood beside a frozen creek, saddle still attached, reins dragging through the snow. The horse was trembling so badly it could barely stand. We searched the surrounding area, expecting to find tracks leading away. Instead, we discovered something that caused every man present to fall silent. A line of footprints crossed the snow less than 30 yards away. Bare feet, human-shaped, larger than any natural person's footprints should have been. They emerged from the white emptiness of the prairie and traveled toward the creek in a perfectly straight line. Halfway there, Caleb's boot prints joined them. That detail chilled me more than the strange tracks themselves. Caleb's footprints did not suggest struggle. They did not suggest pursuit. They followed willingly beside the larger tracks, matching their direction exactly. Side by side, they continued toward the western horizon until distance swallowed them. One of the ranchers wanted to follow. Another refused. An argument began. I remember neither side speaking loudly. The cold seemed to smother every sound. While they debated, I studied the tracks. Then I noticed something that turned my blood cold. Caleb's stride gradually lengthened. Every few yards the distance between his footprints increased. It looked almost as if he had begun walking faster to keep pace with whatever accompanied him. The final tracks visible through my field glass showed him practically running towards something, running willingly. We followed for nearly a mile before sunset forced us to stop. The footprints continued straight west without deviation. No shelter, no destination, nothing except endless frozen prairie. We camped reluctantly that night beside a cluster of rocks. No one slept much. Around midnight, one of the younger men shook me awake. His face was pale. He pointed into the darkness. At first I heard nothing. Then a voice drifted across the frozen land. Help me. It sounded distant, weak, familiar. Caleb. Every man around the campfire recognized it instantly. Help me, the voice called again. It came from somewhere beyond the darkness west of our camp. One rancher immediately stood. Another grabbed his coat before he could leave the firelight. Sit down, the older man ordered. That's Caleb. No, the older man replied. That's something using Caleb. The argument nearly turned violent. Twice men tried to leave camp. Twice they were physically restrained. The voice continued through the night. Sometimes it sounded close enough to touch. Sometimes it seemed miles away. It begged. It cried. It promised it was hurt. It promised it was cold. It promised it would die if we didn't help. Just before dawn, the voice changed. It stopped pleading and began laughing. Not loud laughter. Not human laughter. A strange imitation of laughter, as though something had learned the sound without understanding the emotion behind it. The moment sunlight touched the horizon, the laughter ended. We searched all day. We found no sign of Caleb Turner. No body. No cluing. No blood. Only the tracks. By evening, even the most stubborn members of our party agreed to return home. Caleb was officially listed as missing. His family buried an empty coffin in the spring. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Nearly 8 months later, a traveler arrived at a trading post south of the Canadian River. He claimed to have encountered a lone man walking west across the prairie shortly before sunset. According to the traveler, the stranger was barefoot despite the rough ground. His clothing hung loose, as if he had lost considerable weight. The traveler attempted conversation, but the man never answered. He simply continued walking in a straight line toward the horizon. When the traveler rode closer, he recognized the stranger's face from a wanted notice posted months earlier. It was Caleb Turner, or something that looked exactly like Caleb Turner. The traveler shouted his name several times. Finally, the figure stopped. Slowly it turned. The traveler later swore that Caleb's face remained expressionless except for one detail. His smile. It stretched far wider than any natural smile should have. Terrified, the traveler spurred his horse and fled. By the time he gathered enough courage to look back, the figure had vanished. Most people dismissed the account. Frontier towns survive on rumors. Yet I believed him. Deep down I knew he had seen something real. The years that followed only strengthened that belief. Stories appeared everywhere. Hunters hearing dead relatives calling from canyons. Ranchers finding impossible footprints after storms. Travelers waking at night to the sound of someone whispering their names beyond campfires. Different locations. Different witnesses. Always the same details. The voices belonged to the dead. The tracks moved in impossible straight lines. And those who followed often vanished forever. Eventually, I came to understand something that terrified me more than any monster ever could. Whatever wandered those lonely places was not hunting bodies. It was hunting memory. It borrowed the faces we loved, the voices we missed, the people we mourned. It studied grief the way wolves study prey. It learned exactly what each victim wanted most and used that longing as bait. Years later, when my hair had begun turning gray, I returned to the region one final time. I was older then, slower, and far less confident than a young scout who once chased mysteries across the prairie. One evening, I stood alone watching sunset spread red across the horizon. For a few moments the world became perfectly still. No wind, no birds, no insects, absolute silence. Then I heard a voice behind me, a voice I had not heard in nearly 30 years. My mother's voice. Soft, familiar, impossible. She simply said my name. Nothing more. Every hair on my body stood upright. I did not turn around. I remembered the widow's warning. I remembered Caleb. I remembered the footprints in the snow. So I stared at the horizon and answered aloud. You're not my mother. The silence lasted several seconds. Then another voice replied from somewhere behind me. It was deeper, colder, not human at all. No, it said. I left immediately. I did not run, but I never looked back. I never returned to that country again. Now, as an old man approaching the end of my life, I sometimes wonder whether the thing still walks those empty places. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it always will. The land remembers older rules than ours. Maybe some corners of the world belong to forces that existed long before roads, fences, and maps arrived. If that is true, then there is only one lesson worth passing on. Should you ever find yourself alone beneath a vast, empty sky, and should you hear the voice of someone you lost long ago calling your name from the darkness, do not answer. Do not follow. Do not let grief guide your feet. Because out there, beyond the last fence and the last light, something is still learning the sound of human sorrow. And once it learns yours, it may never stop calling.